I recently wrote an opinion piece that sparked a great conversation about coaching competency 7.11. This competency indicates that coaches should be sharing observation, knowledge, and feelings without attachment that have a potential to create new insights for the client. It is a real balancing act. Some coaches are so committed to neutrality that they withhold information when their client actually needs it. Other coaches might take 7.11 as a license to share every idea that pops into their head. So today, I want to explore this. How do we share knowledge cleanly when it serves our client while keeping them in the driver's seat? How do we stay present as coaches even when we're offering expertise? But first, let me give you the context of the article if you haven't read it yet. So I wrote about this tension I've been sitting with. Sometimes as coaches, we stay rigidly in our coaching questions when a client just genuinely needs information we have. So they're struggling with something that's perhaps an existing framework or a tool would address. Like in my story, a product manager trying to build a prioritization system from scratch when RISE, Moscow, and other standard frameworks already exist and may be helpful in her situation. And as coaches, we may sometimes watch them struggle. We keep asking questions because we have learned that good coaches don't give advice, which is true. But is that always ethical to do that? Or is there a point where withholding information we have crosses from professional discipline into something else? Now, that's what this article explores. Now, let's also frame here that we're talking about professional coaching, where coaching is the main service that you're delivering. As an Agile coach, for example, I would also be working as a trainer or a mentor, facilitator, maybe even a consultant. This article and also this video will be fully focused on the work we do as professional coach. So let's dive in. So the question I got was focused on the ICF Core Competency 7.11, which clearly allows coaches to share knowledge. And they're absolutely right. Let me read it to you exactly. The coach shares observations, knowledge, and feelings without attachment that have the potential to create new insights for the client. And it's right there in the competency. Coaches can share knowledge. So, problem solved, right? We can just share what we know when clients need it and we're fully within our ethical boundaries. Well, yes and no. And I want to spend some time really unpacking this because I think there is something critically important hiding in that phrase without attachment. So let's start with that phrase, without attachment. What does that actually mean in practice? I think it means a few things. First, without attachment to whether they use it or not. If I share a framework and they say, well, that doesn't resonate with me, I need to be completely fine with that. Not defensive, not trying to convince them or sharing it why it's so important. Not suddenly be disappointed that my brilliant insight didn't land. Second, without attachment to being right. If I share knowledge and it turns out it does not apply to their context, or it doesn't work the way I thought it would, I can't be invested in defending it. It was just information, not a gospel, right? Third, and this is the hardest one, without attachment to being seen as the expert, without needing them to think that I'm valuable as a coach because I know things they don't. So because, let's be honest, it feels good to share knowledge. It feels good when a client says, oh, wow, that framework, that tool, that question, that is exactly what I needed. It feels good to be helpful in a tangible way. And that feeling that you then get, that is attachment. So here's what I've observed, both in my own practice and, of course, in supervision or mentor coaching with other coaches. Once we open the door to sharing knowledge, it becomes really, really hard to know when and how to close it. You share one framework, the client finds it helpful, they're grateful, they may tell you how much that insight helped them. Next session, they come back with another challenge, and somewhere in their mind, maybe consciously or not, they're hoping you have another tool, framework, or tip. And perhaps you may actually feel drawn to that as well. So perhaps you share another framework and another idea, and slowly, subtly, the relationship changes. They start coming to sessions expecting your expertise, not exploring their own thinking. So you start preparing for sessions by thinking about what tools you could offer, not what questions or what explorations you would like to bring their client to. And suddenly you're not coaching anymore. You're more like a consultant with coaching questions sprinkled right through it. So let me give you a real example from my own practice about one of my clients that found it very difficult to give meaningful and difficult feedback to her team. She'd been avoiding a conversation with one of her direct reports for weeks, and she knew it was affecting the entire team's performance. So we did good coaching work. We explored what was making the conversation feel difficult. We looked at her beliefs about conflict. We examined what she was afraid might happen, etc., etc. And then in the middle of the session, I mentioned the SBI feedback framework: situation, behavior, impact. And I said something like, a lot of leaders find it helpful to structure feedback around specific situations and observable behaviors rather than general judgment. Are you familiar with this tool? And she wasn't. So I explained it a little bit to her and, you know, how that worked. And she loved it. She loved it. She used it that week. She came back to the next session saying, oh, that was amazing. Great framework. And the conversation went so much better than I expected. What other tools do you have for managing difficult team dynamics? So there was more, right? And right there, I could feel it. There was a shift. She was now coming to our coaching conversation to collect tools and tips and helpful ideas, not to develop her own thinking or her own leadership capability. She was, she was coming for my brilliance. And here is the uncomfortable part. It was also lovely to hear how helpful I had been, right? And so I myself had also perhaps stepped into that danger zone of becoming attached. So, what is the danger here? The danger is a relationship based on dependency, not on mutual growth. When we make ourselves the source of valuable knowledge, our clients start to need us in a way that's different from coaching. They start to need our expertise, not our facilitation of their thinking. And that fundamentally changes what coaching is. Coaching is supposed to build our own capacity. It's supposed to help people develop their own ability to navigate challenges and make decisions and solve their own problems. And when they leave the coaching relationship, they should be more capable, more resourceful, more confident in their own thinking. In this way, the client will find the best solution for their context and their situation. Also, in a coaching relationship, the strategy your client builds is a lasting one that will help the client become the best leader, for example, in my case, they could possibly be. But if they've spent our time together collecting frameworks, ideas, and following my insights, what happens when they face a new challenge I haven't got an idea for? You might leave them stuck. So why does the ICF allow it? If sharing knowledge is so dangerous, then why does the ICF competency explicitly allow it? I think it's because there are genuine moments where sharing knowledge serves the client's learning in a way that just asking questions cannot. Also, many coaches are expected to bring a certain expertise to the conversation, such as leadership coaching, business coaching. The ICF realizes this too, but, and I hope that this is true, also wants you to stay in your coaching presence while sharing any knowledge or insights. So, for example, that product manager I wrote about in my article, she was trying to build a prioritization framework from scratch. She spent 3 sessions working on it and she was getting nowhere, right? Because she'd never been exposed to these prioritization frameworks. So, she didn't have a thinking problem, she had a knowledge problem. And in that case, in the role of a leadership coach, making her aware that these frameworks exist, not telling her which one to use and how to use it, but just making her aware they exist, that served her learning and gave her options to explore. But here's where we have to be really careful. There's a massive difference between many product managers use frameworks like RISE or Moscow for prioritization. Are you familiar with those? And you should use the RISE framework in your situation. The first shares knowledge, the second tells them what to do. Now, the first expands the landscape of options, the second actually narrows their autonomy. So, Competency 7.11 only gives us permission for the first option, but in practice, that line gets blurry really fast because often when we share a framework, we're not neutral about it, or an idea, right? We think it will help, we think it's a good idea, and we're kind of hoping they'll use it. So also be aware that your own feelings may get in the way of staying neutral in that situation. And of course, sharing knowledge should never become giving advice in disguise. I always tell my students when they are learning coaching, um, if you know the answer to your question, that's a leading question. But there's another critical piece of that competency that I would also like to highlight. Let me read it again. Shares observations, knowledge, and feelings without attachment that have the potential to create new insights for the client. The potential to create new insights for the client. That's not the same as giving them information. That's not the same as teaching them something. That's specifically about creating new insights. So let's be really clear about what that means. If I tell a client about the RISE framework and they say, oh, that's helpful, I'll use that. Have I created a new insight? Or have I just given them a tool? That's quite different. A new insight is when something shifts in how they see their situation, when it creates an aha moment that changes their perspective. But if I'm just giving them a tool to apply, that's not an insight, that's instruction. Another way to look at it is the difference between instruction and broadening their perspective. Many product managers use the RISE framework, reach, impact, confidence, effort, to prioritize their features and their work. So you could perhaps try that. Or I'm curious, you've been talking about prioritization as if every decision is equally important. What if some decisions are actually about maximizing reach and others are about minimizing effort? How might that change how you approach this? And then if they're exploring that distinction and it feels relevant, there are frameworks that separate those dimensions. Would it be useful to know what they are? So it sounds a little bit leading and it may be helpful, but you also have to really think things through before you bring it in. And, we all know, and when we're coaching, we're more listening than talking. So I can't be listening and thinking about how I'm going to bring something to my client. So there is a different way that you can share knowledge in a way that creates insight rather than dependency on your awesomeness. So there's a way to share what you know that keeps the client still in their driver's seat. And that's all about staying and sharing your story in the first person instead of saying, you should use the RISE framework, or many product managers use this framework, try this. As always, you show partnering behavior. Would it be helpful if I shared a way I dealt with a situation like this? And then you tell your story, your actual lived experience. When I was leading product at this company, I was drowning in feature requests. Everything felt urgent, etc. Somebody introduced me to this framework, reach, impact, confidence, effort. And what I found, and then you go on telling them the story. You tell the story, what worked well, what didn't work well, what you learned from it, how you adapted it, etc. Keep it short as well. It doesn't have to be an entire book, right? So after you've shared that, you allow a few moments of silence and you bring it back to the client. What about this might be inspiring for you, if anything? And do you notice what I just did? I shared the framework, but I shared it as my story, what I experienced, what I learned, or what we co learned in the organization. And that allows the client to share their thoughts from your own context. And here's why that's powerful. As you're telling your story from the first person perspective, the client's listening, but they're not just passively receiving your information. They're actually seeing themselves in your story. They're mentally testing it against their own situation. Oh, maybe I'm also conflating those things too. Wait, that dimension wouldn't work for us, but I could use another one. I wonder if my team does need those conversations around this framework. They are doing the work while you're talking. They're applying it, adapting it, and building from it. And then when you finish, they will tell you directly what resonated and what didn't. That makes such a difference. I think the confidence dimension is exactly what we're missing. Or interesting, I don't think scoring would work in our culture, but that question about strategic alignment, that's what we need to be asking. They're not following your advice. They're taking your experience as a data point and building their own approach from it. You didn't tell them how to use it, what to do with it, and how it is so important that in their context this would work. You told them what happened when you used it. So they learned from listening to you. If you do this, you're giving people information without taking away that precious agency about what their next steps are. So this approach changes everything because it maintains the coaching dynamic even while sharing knowledge. When I say, you should or could or have ever thought of or using this framework, I am positioning myself as the expert who knows what's right for you. You are now receiving my expertise. The power dynamic shifts. But when I say, here's what happened when I tried this, I'm positioning myself as someone with experience to share, but you're still the expert on your own situation. And here's another beautiful thing about first person storytelling it is inherently without attachment. Because I'm not telling you what to do, I'm telling you what I did. It if it doesn't fit your situation, that doesn't mean I was wrong or you didn't listen. It just means our contexts are different. So just to bring it down to a structure that I use. So first, I ask permission. Would it be helpful if I shared how I or somebody else I know approached a similar challenge? Then I set up my context. When I was in that situation, I was struggling with challenge and I share what I tried. I used this tool, framework, approach, idea. Here's how it worked. I share what happened, what worked, what didn't work, what I found, like results or learnings or surprised me, I explicitly name how I adapted it because, we never use anything specifically the way it was intended. And then I hand it back to the client. I don't know if any of that resonates with your situation, but that was my experience. What if anything feels relevant to you in the case that you're facing right now? And so that last part is crucial because I'm not asking, so how will you use this now? Or are you going to use this? I'm asking what feels relevant? How does this inspire you, if any, right? I am still helping them explore ideas. And so what will happen most often is that the client doesn't just, take your framework and apply it, they will build from it. They will say things like, "Ooh, that dimension makes sense, but for us, I think we need to oh, I love that question. I'm going to ask it in this way, though." Or something like, "Oh, that wouldn't work in our culture, but it makes me think," right? They're using your experience as a springboard for their own thinking. And so I do really believe that section or core competency 7.11 is designed for us to do that, to share knowledge without attachment, but only when we see that there is a potential for learning, not creating dependency. Let me get back to that manager that I was coaching. Remember the one with the difficult feedback? What happened, I'd shared a tool with her and she was coming back for more tools. So after she'd asked, what other tools do you have for managing team dynamics, I had to pause because I could feel my own attachment rising and her dependency growing. But instead of just staying silent and in a coaching mode, I tried something different. I said, would it be helpful if I shared a time where I struggled with team dynamics and what I learned from it? And she said, yes. So I told her a story, a real one, about a time when I was leading a team and two people were constantly in conflict, how I kept trying to solve it by getting them to work it out, and how that actually made it worse. How I finally learned that my role wasn't to fix their relationship, it was to be clear about what the team needed from both of them and let them figure out how to deliver that. I told her what I tried, what didn't work, what I wish I'd done differently, and what I finally learned. And then I said, I don't know if any of that maps to what you're dealing with, but that was my experience. And so she was quiet for a moment and then she shared with me in her own words, what strikes me is that I've been trying to fix the dynamic, like it's my job to make everybody get along, but maybe my job is just to be clear about what we need to accomplish together. And that wasn't my insight, that was hers. So my story created the conditions for her to have that one. And here what's powerful. She didn't walk away with a tool I gave her. She walked away with a shift in how she understood her role and her leadership capabilities. That's learning, that's growth, that's perhaps even transformation. And that's what happens when you share knowledge through story in a way that creates insight rather than instruction. So when does sharing knowledge through first person storytelling actually serve the client? So here are a few criteria. One of them is your client is stuck in a way that suggests a different perspective could unlock their thinking. Not just any kind of stuck, but stuck because they're seeing their challenge through their own lens. One lens and a different lens might help. Second, you have a genuinely relevant experience that maps to their challenge, not kind of similar, actually relevant. And you can tell your story honestly, including what didn't work, what you learned, and how it may have been adapted. If you're stretching to make your story fit, or if you're only telling the success part, don't share it. It's not helpful. Third, your story can create the potential for insight, not just information. Ask yourself, will hearing about my experience help them see their situation differently, or am I just giving them a technique to try? If it's just a technique, probably don't share it as a story. Fourth, you should be able to let go of whether they take anything from your story. If you share your story and then find yourself hoping they'll do what you did or feeling disappointed if they didn't, then you're probably attached to your own brilliance. So here is the framework. Step 1, ask permission. Would it be helpful if I shared? Step 2, you tell from your own perspective how you did it. Step 3, hand it back to them. I don't know if anything resonates with you. That was just my experience. What feels relevant? And then continue coaching. Okay? Competency 7.11 gives us permission. First person storytelling gives us a method, but only we can provide the discipline of sharing without attachment. That's the coaching work that you have to do. That's the practice. That's what makes coaches instead of consultants who ask questions. So here's my challenge to you. Next time you're tempted to share a framework or piece of knowledge in a coaching session, pause. Ask yourself, is this knowledge I can share through my own first person story? Can I tell the messy real version, including what didn't work, while also keeping it short? Can I genuinely let go of whether they take anything from my story? And will hearing my experience have the potential to create new insights, or am I just giving something to try? And if you decide to share, use that structure. Would it be helpful? Tell your story. I don't know if anything is relevant, what resonates, and then coach whatever emerges. Be honest with yourself about your attachment. Don't just share 7 stories either. That's not helpful. Because this is where the real ethical line is, I think, not in whether we share knowledge, but how we share it, why we share it, and whether we can truly do it without attachment to the outcome. Thank you for listening to my little rant on this brilliant adaptation of the core competencies, and I hope that it makes sense for you. And maybe this even created some potential new insights for yourself as well.